Now, this next story, this Candace Owens story, has warped and evolved over time. I mean, there was a time she used to work at the Daily Wire and she started talking about this story, and they weren't too fond of it, and they eventually let her go between that and her war with Rabbi Shmuley. I think that really put a nail in the coffin. But Candace has stayed on this story. She's stayed on the story far beyond where you would see maybe returns for it. She's definitely taken a lot of questioning because of this story. And I've questioned, why does she keep covering this story? What is the real evidence behind the story? Is there something there? Or is it just much ado about nothing? Something. I don't know. But this past week, Candace Owens interviewed the French journalist who originally broke the story. And this is not the French journalist who is being sued for libel. That's somebody else, and that's covered in the story. So the gentleman that you're about to hear, who's interviewed by Candace and has a translator, I thought it was very well done, by the way. It was very listenable, and I could understand what he's saying and putting on the record, and it makes more and more sense that there might be, like, we just saw the Olympics, right? That whole opening ceremony. I think there's probably more of that in France than we realized. That's all. I mean, France, you were a great ally during the American Revolution, and you helped us fight off the British. And the British and the French have fought for a long time, but they agree on things like the deep state, child trafficking, drug monopolies, those sort of things. Evil, if you will. So let's go down deep in that rabbit hole. Let's dig up the story on Macron's wife. And who is Macron himself? Is David de Rothschild his godfather? Like, there's some interesting things that come up in this conversation that I did not think I was going to hear. And then I had to, like, let my fingers do the walking and start looking stuff up. And how is he the youngest partner at the Rothschild Bank when he's not a banker? This Macron guy who gets groomed when he's 14 by an older man who might have been, I don't know, but I don't know. I don't even know if the math works in these claims that you're going to hear, because if he was 49 back then when Macron was 14, how old's his wife now in real chronological age if it's the dude? I don't know. We're going to think about this together. We're going to try to figure it out. We're going to try to disambiguate this enigma wrapped inside a riddle, inside of a question of who is Macron's wife? And is it it's a question. I'm going to leave it to you to answer. I'm not going to make a claim, but it's certainly interesting enough to include in this week's episode. So let's go to Candace Owens and the interview that, I don't know, could be breaking France's internet if they didn't already know such things.
All right, guys. So the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. That obviously is a quotation, a very popular quotation from George Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984. It was a fictional warning of the society to come, a prediction that a global elite would control a society with a centralized economy, where there would be thought police, criminalized speech, a ministry of truth, which would wipe away history and rule society with an ever-present. Well, today that society, that fictional society, has become a reality. We have the Ministry of Truth in the form of mainstream journalists. They lie to protect the global elite, fact checkers and smears of any opponents to their official version of past and present. You know, I started to realize that 1984 was a reality when I quite accidentally stumbled upon the curious case of Brigitte Macron. Yes, the First Lady of France, as presented in a set of documents, a series written by a journalist named Xavier Poussard. He insisted that Brigitte Macron was actually born a man named Jean-Michel Trogneau. And I thought, that's so kooky and crazy. It's going to be super easy to debunk that. And boy, was I in for a surprise, realizing that he had done years of research and presented a solid case that Brigitte Macron was in fact born a man. So now what's happened? Well, of course, they didn't accept that. The mainstream press called everybody crazy and a conspiracy theorist and unhinged. We've heard all of their words, their pedophile psychology, as I like to call it, thanks to Sigmund Freud being the father of that sort of gaslighting. Now I'm going to show you a photo, and I want to remind you not to believe your own eyes. Here's a photo of Brigitte Macron. She's vacationing with her husband on a boat. And here it is closer. And it does seem that there might be something that doesn't belong. But again, do not believe your own eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat today because I have been in communication with the journalist that broke this massive story. In a fair world, and we don't live in one, he would have won a Pulitzer. Instead, what is happening is that he is all but avoiding going back to France, not because he's being prosecuted for breaking the story, but because now they are trying to boggle him down legally by digging up an old story he wrote 3 years ago and accusing him of, you're not going to believe it, guys, anti-Semitism. Breaking the rules of anti-Semitism, as what he's actually doing is potentially exposing a pedophile ring that doesn't just expand across France, but as we are starting to realize as we do more research, it does appear to be a global elite ring. So we're going to speak to him, going to remind you that there still has not been a single photo presented to the public that is not easily debunked of Brigitte Macron growing up. His theory? Well, Jean-Michel Trogneau lived as a man until 1980, when he assumed the identity of his little sister, Brigitte. And ever since then, the media will not present any photos or just simply have Jean-Michel Trogneau walk out with his sister if he does, in fact, exist. And by the way, he does exist. It's just that he's now living as Brigitte Macron. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what we have coming up, an incredible exclusive interview with Xavier Poussard. Don't go away. All right, guys, I promised you a treat. I am so excited to have Xavier Poussard here. And as I mentioned, there have been so many lies in the mainstream media just trying to distract people from looking into this strange case of Brigitte Macron, leading people to believe that the young woman is being sued because she lied about Brigitte being a man, when in fact that young woman did not publish the initial set of articles. It was published in Fait Set Documents, and the writer who we're speaking with today, his name is Xavier Poussard. Xavier, thank you so much for joining me. I'll jump in right away with a question. How did you begin this investigation?
Merci, Candace, pour l'invitation.
Thank you for the invitation, Candace. First off, this investigation is just one. We're a confidential newsletter which is published in print. Essentially, our publication deals with news pertaining to powered networks, and we're also an archive center. In 2012, we opened a file pertaining to Brigitte Macron because the history surrounding her seemed very strange. At that time, Emmanuel Macron was appointed principal advisor to the socialist president François Hollande.
Sorry, could you say there appeared to be some documentation?
Et en accumulant de la documentation, nous nous sommes...
Yes, as we accumulated documents and evidence, we saw that it didn't match the story of Brigitte Macron. At the time, there was an intense campaign by the media to promote Emmanuel Macron as a candidate against the right wing, and they were really promoting the character of Brigitte Macron as well. However, every time her story was told, inconsistencies kept emerging. The narrative in 2019 was that they had an age difference of 20 years and that she was Emmanuel Macron's French professor, yet a very gorgeous and beautiful woman, and that all the students were in love with her. This initial narrative that there is an age difference of 19 years, instead of incurring blame, the media stated Emmanuel Macron was almost of legal age. He was presented as this virile, promising, aspiring young man who was charming and seductive to this beautiful woman, and who had the right stuff to be head of state.
Even with just that narrative, the age difference, it's very strange to think that the media would not have further questions, and yet they sort of presented this couple as a love story, a modern love story of a woman who left her family because she fell so in love with a student. but then you were able to determine that even the ages that they were presenting to the public were not correct of when they fell in love. Is that right?
A senior journalist in French public television wrote a book proposing and confronting all the narratives about how they met. This included information that Brigitte Macron had been his theater professor, not his French professor, and that he was in fact 14 and she 39 when they initially met. So in essence, it was a case of an adult involved with a minor. After having gathered all published photos of Brigitte Macron, we concluded that there was no clear continuum of her physical appearance throughout the years. The press touted many members of the Trogneau family, Brigitte's family, to the French electorate, comparing them to the Kennedys, and not just a family of chocolate makers from Amiens, north of Paris. All the biographies published emphasized the members of the family, for the simple fact that Macron is a technocrat. So to balance this, the media was selling an image of a family which was really grounded in the country, grounded in real France. Even with all this, we discovered that there was one brother, Jean-Michel Trogneau, who did not appear in any of the biographies. I asked all my contacts, do you have anything on Brigitte? And in particular, one of my contacts, who is a civil servant, looked at me with a grin and said, "He's a man." Well, if this is true, then who is this man? So the official biographies should be rewritten. One of my contacts told me about Natasha Ray, a journalist who was able to explain and establish that Brigitte is a man. I contacted this Natasha Ray, and it turned out she was not a journalist, just a concerned citizen who, like me and like others, had asked questions about Brigitte Macron and who had compiled evidence and had started from the hypothesis that it was a man. While looking at the material, she had found in the family photo a little boy who was this hidden brother whom I had already identified but hadn't yet matched a face to, and who was indeed Jean-Michel Trogneau. So we agreed that I would publish her findings in this investigation.
Wow. And just so my audience is clear, Natasha Ray is the one that the media is trying to present as the person who published the document. She is the one that is currently being sued. We're going to discuss the actual reason she's being sued for, but Xavier Poussard is not being sued for libel in France whatsoever. So you start to gather these documents and you start to realize the pictures coming together. And I just want to say, for me, one of the things that I encourage my audience to do is believe their eyes. And as soon as I saw that there were really only 2 photos that were ever presented as a young Brigitte Macron, the first photo being the one that we're going to show right now, it was very obvious to me that Brigitte looked like the person on the left in the family photo. And this is the first photo that we see. We're told that Brigitte is the person that's sitting on her mother's lap, but it's very clear to me that Brigitte looks exactly like the person on the left. And that was before I read the Jean-Michel Trogneau thesis. And then they presented this second photo, which is very clearly a recolorized photo, which looks exactly like Brigitte's daughter, who he fathered, Typhon. And I just thought it was amazing that they were trying to pass off these fake photos, which is bizarre. So the legend, as you were just explaining, is that, oh, they fell in love when they were in school. It was lovely. Things went on. Brigitte's from a small town in Amiens. Her family were in the chocolate industry. You read this biography, you start realizing none of this is real. What did you do? What did your paper, rather, that you presented to the public discover or not discover about Jean-Michel Trogneau? Who is Jean-Michel Trogneau?
Alors d'abord sur la photo de Tiphaine, sur la photo présentée comme la communiante.
First, on the photo of Tiphaine as the communicant, we cross-referenced this photo. Now, this photo is indeed Brigitte Trogneau, and this is where it becomes interesting. It is a fact that Jean-Michel Trogneau is an individual who calls himself Brigitte and has assumed the identity of his younger sister, Brigitte Trogneau. I'll summarize my conclusions from this as follows. The girl in white, the communicant, is Brigitte Trogneau. The central problem is that Brigitte, this so-called Brigitte, is not Brigitte Trogneau. It's her brother, Jean-Michel Trogneau. As soon as we started working with Natasha, she was immediately taken into custody and detained in a police station for this investigation. At the time, we did not have enough evidence, and so we relayed her hypothesis, which was partially false since we didn't have all the evidence. After the publication of these documents, all the proceedings in the trial against Natasha Ray target a video that she made herself on the channel of a clairvoyant. And actually, all the prosecutions are based on inaccuracies which are due to the fact that Natasha Ray is not a journalist and not well versed in media rules and regulations. So after the first phase in 2021, from 2022 up until 2024, we continued our investigation and we were able to collect 5 exclusive photos of Jean-Michel Trogneau from the past, all in coherence, proving that Brigitte Macron is Jean-Michel Trogneau, and we were able to recover and compile 4 exclusive photos of Brigitte Trogneau. Of course, these are not of the public-facing Brigitte Macron.
Donc, pour résumer,
from these, the age difference is actually greater. Initially, he was 17 years old and met someone who was 36, then 14 and 39 respectively. But it is in fact a 14-year-old boy who initially met someone aged 47.
Wow.
This case is clearly about the abuse of a minor, as well as impersonation or identity theft. I'm not looking at this from a moral perspective, but rather from a legal one. In my newspaper, our methodology is a time-tested and solid one. We accumulate evidence and cross-reference it, so I assert to the public that Brigitte Macron is a man named Jean-Michel Trogneau who was born on February 11th, 1945.
Sorry, give me that date again. 11th of February, 1945. Of February 1945. And I just want to clarify. So you are saying that the legend, which was sold to the public, that, you know, a 17-year-old boy or young man fell in love with his 34, 36-year-old teacher is fictitious. And the truth is that Emmanuel Macron was only 14 years old and Brigitte Macron was how old? Are you saying 47?
47. 47.
So she was 47 years old when they met. So in this case, it was roughly 6 years before Brigitte met Emmanuel Macron when he was 14 that she, Jean-Michel Trogneau, in reality, started to live with her sister's identity.
6 years before, used a fake identity. Wow, explosive. So one of the things that I found very interesting was this story to me is such a huge story that when I actually read through your documents and saw all of the proof, it's undeniable that Brigitte Macron was born a man. And yet when you presented it to the public, and similarly when I presented it to the public, I would think the media would jump on this and begin their own investigations, but instead the media attacked it as a lie and as a conspiracy theory. How were you treated when you published the documents? I mean, and by the way, I just want to say, unbelievable that the state detained Natasha Ray before you had even published it. But once you did publish it, what happened in France?
Alors la réaction a été...
The reaction was immediate. First, Natasha was detained for a day on the presumption of a misdemeanor, and it was probably because my cell phone was tapped. My webmaster was also arrested in France, but I was not, as I was careful not to be in France at the time. After the publication of the first part of the investigation in 2021, all of our companies underwent a tax audit, the usual harassment procedure. There was a tax control on my companies, and once this case was published by Natasha and her psychic, all my bank accounts, personal and professional, were closed without explanation.
All right, guys, jumping in to tell you about 7 Weeks Coffee and a couple of them called Weeks, clearly pregnant-free, code in 7. Okay, so just to get that clear, so I want to make sure I get this right. So Natasha Ray was then immediately detained for a day, and then they launched a tax investigation on who?
All my bank accounts, professional and private, were closed.
Wow.
And there was a strange ambiance in this case, a French ambiance in this case. For example, a journalist in Liberal of Lopes, which is a weekly publication of the Groupe Le Monde. It's like the New York Times. It's a liberal left woman who said, okay, this is fake news. And first of all the pieces she discovered arrived at the same conclusion we had. And then she was followed by the Secret Service in a hostel where she had a meeting with Natasha. So it was a very strange thing. It's like in your United States with big corporations. In Paris, there's an expression that says, Brigitte is untouchable. And in fact, one humorist who was on national TV in France was fired for saying Brigitte was abusing and oppressing a student because Brigitte and the government just have so much power. And a lot of journalists are afraid to cover this case. And due to the nature of the case, it involving a minor and abuse, many people aren't comfortable pursuing it. There are multiple theories around Macron. You could say it's a pedophile network with a lot of people in France involved in these crimes. For example, the French Department of Justice is run by Eric Dupont-Moretti, who is a lawyer famous for the Procès du Trois case, where 12 children were victims of sex crimes, but he got all the accused abusers off and they are now free. Another example was an incest case where he obtained plea deals for the defendants and really advocated for organized crime groups and these pedophile networks. And there's a lot of people like this around Macron. For example, Jack Long, who is the chair of the Arab World Institute, was involved in the Epstein case. You must remember that when Epstein was arrested in New York, he was invited to France to attend the 30th anniversary of the Louvre Pyramid by Long, with all the French establishment in attendance. You must also recall that Ghislaine Maxwell is originally from France, so is Jean-Luc Brunel. So there is an aura of pedophilia surrounding those in power in France under Macron and under Brigitte Macron, and all the journalists know, but they don't say anything because they're afraid to lose their jobs.
Yes, and it's incredible that there is this exact same thing happening in America right now. I mean, they fully attacked me for exposing a similar pedophile network of power that is happening here in America. And I know that I messaged you and I was explaining this to you, that it is so strange that even when you say, hey, it's very weird that they keep protecting pedophiles, you start to realize that the media, which we refer to as the establishment media, you refer to it as corporate media, are quite literally employed to protect pedophiles in power and to ruin the lives of any independent journalists who risk everything to tell the public. I want to ask you, Xavier, because there was something very interesting in your article pertaining to Emmanuel Macron. Now, my theory is that it is very plausible that they are putting pedophiles and their victims into positions of power so that they can control them all across the world. I believe that they are putting pedophiles in power. And I was very compelled by your investigation into Emmanuel Macron's childhood. Now, the legend holds that he was raised by his grandmother and didn't have a very close relationship with his biological parents. Am I correct in stating that his grandmother worked at a trans clinic at some point, or Emmanuel Macron's family worked at a trans clinic? Can you elaborate on that?
First of all, we don't know much about Macron. He grew up with his grandmother, and the house they lived in is now closed. It's very strange. There's no photos that exist of Macron with his parents before the age of 25. What we discovered is that a woman named Françoise Nogues, who was presented as the mother of Emmanuel Macron, was in charge of a medical program for transgender people in France. This information was never in the newspapers, and there are testimonies that we found where transgender people are thanking Francois Nogues for this program. And the strange point here is, when we researched the life of Jean-Michel Trogneau with Brigitte, we found that they're connected to Emmanuel Macron. All of these elements are very strange, and we must remember that Macron, before he was president, he was a banker at Rothschilds & Co., but he doesn't have the qualifications to be a banker.
Yeah.
A colleague of his said that it is peculiar that he became the youngest associate. In the report, we see that Brigitte Macron is very close with David de Rothschild, like family. He is the godfather of Macron. And you have to remember that David de Rothschild is the president of the World Jewish Congress. So it's for this reason that whenever anyone brings up Brigitte Macron and pedophilia, they are accused of anti-Semitism. For example, you, Candace, are accused of this. Zoe Sagon, who is a Twitter account who helped me publish this case, was banned after pressure from Jewish organizations. And during a radio show, I gave a list to the owner of a French media outlet, and France called Italy to bring accusations of anti-Semitism. 3 hours ago, a list appeared in a left-leaning paper called Le Monde Diplomatique, and it's an official list that says, Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, you are an anti-Semite. It makes no sense. The question is, why is everyone who pursues this case of Macron being labeled as an anti-Semite? The answer is very simple. It is because David de Rothschild is the godfather of Macron and the president of the World Jewish Congress. And if you look at the Epstein case, there is a financial structure to support their operation. It's a mega group created by Leslie Wexner and Edgar Bronfman, who was the chairman of the World Jewish Congress at the time. And the documents, the Austrian passport that the FBI found at Epstein's house, were a gift from Ronald Lauder, who helped Epstein in his case, and later became the president of the World Jewish Congress. You can see that it was this organization that called the Epstein case a controlled accident, and which Putin called a collective accident with blackmail on people who are really puppets, and do what they're told because they don't want their private lives shown to the public.
This is fascinating, and it's fascinating because the fact that you are now being accused of anti-Semitism for a piece that you wrote 3 years ago, and in reality, what you're trying to do today is to expose a pedophile ring, and to know that that is exactly what is happening to me only reaffirms my belief that what we have right now is a pedophile ring that has assumed a ton of power in the world by pretending that any person that notices this pedophile ring is an anti-Semite. My theory is that these people are not Jewish. I think that they have, they publicly present themselves as being Jewish, but in reality, they worship and follow an entirely different faith, and it's satanic. That is why I have encouraged my listeners to learn who Jacob Frank was, to learn what Frankism was, because that never went away and it came to America. And when these pedophiles get caught, they say, oh, I'm Jewish. This is blood libel. This is blood libel. And it's so important for Jewish people to wake up and to understand that this is not blood libel. This is not anti-Semitism. These are demonic, monstrous people that are using Judaism to hide what their actions are. And it just can't be the case that every person that discovers pedophilia is then accused of anti-Semitism by the very powerful media organ. So I want to ask you about Tefan now, the daughter of Brigitte Macron, because Tefan seems to be the only person in Brigitte's...
All right, so as you could tell, that interview goes on longer than we can play it right now. If you're interested in that story, dig into it. If you don't find it interesting, ignore it. She just mentioned Jacob Frank. That is something you should not ignore. And there are many episodes of Grand Theft World podcast where we have talked about Jacob Frank and several others that she was just talking about. The history of Zionism growing in America is part of that legacy. Jacob Frank goes back to Sabotage Zevi or Sabotage Zvi. There's a bunch of different ways to spell his name. Anyway, if you want to search things that have been talked about in Grand Theft World, or if you want to see if something's been talked about in Grand Theft World, you can go to gtw.clipgenie.com and you can have your search queries. And then, of course, in the search queries, you could view the show and it'll bring up the transcript. Here's Jacob Frank. We could download, we can make a clip, we could put it out. Oh, look, lots of mentions. Anyway, that is education yet to be had. I just wanted to pick up on that part of it. Also, going back to it, that whole Macron thing, tying into the Epstein thing, tying into the one nation under blackmail thing, brings up and begs the question. It is a fallacy to beg the question as your reasoned argument, but to beg a question to start an inquiry is okay. So we're going to beg the question, how did Emmanuel Macron become a banker at Rothschild? And when you start digging into it, they've got some footage and they could tell you the official story and, these sort of things. But then there's also these questions about his relationship with David de Rothschild. And he does call him a protege, Macron, but it's unlimited access for only $1. So what I did was I didn't take him up on that offer. I said, nice offer, Financial Times. I'm going to copy the URL. I'm going to go to the Internet Archive, as we usually do on this show. We're going to go to archive. Oh, geez. Financial Times beat us, LD. They have learned our racket. They're like, we're going to put up a paywall so you can't even see it in the past. I went to a 2018 reference for this article, and we keep just getting kind of results like this. So I might have done it wrong. Let me go back to the number of captures that they did on it. But you could see they have an article, and if you want to pay them, you can learn about David de Rothschild. But if we go over here to Haaretz, they also know about that, but they don't want to let you read the article either. You got to subscribe. So anyway, there is a history of David de Rothschild and his relationship with Emmanuel Macron that goes beyond his being too hot for the male teacher, dude looks like a lady situation that he's got going on. I'm not judging. I'm just saying it's an interesting history that the French have. And we'll learn more about that as we go on. I'm sure in the weeks to come, those types of stories are going to keep growing. Now, last week, we talked about a story from a Hewlett-Packard owned company, a software company started by Mike Lynch called Autonomy. Not the course that I'm going to talk about in a second, but it does tie into that story. So Mike Lynch, he had an accident on the yacht, and his co-defendant in the case also had an accident, got run over by a car while he was jogging, and some of the lawyers died. So there's a body count to that whole situation. So it appears that HP told Mike Lynch, we'll give you $8 billion or $11 billion for your company. And then when HP gets it, they don't really want to pay the guy for the company. And so maybe the guy's just dead and his partner's dead. And now HP has that intellectual property. I'm not saying that's how it happened. I'm just saying it seems to be what's going on. And if I hear the words Hewlett and Packard together, most people think of information technology and computers and things like that. I think of David Packard and the Trilateral Commission and David Packard's role in firing Anthony Sutton from the Hoover Institute for Peace, which is great because for the liberty community, that's how Anthony Sutton becomes a freedom writer, and his work is impeccable. But also David Packard fired a little known guy named, what was his name? Oh yeah, Steve Jobs. He fired him from Apple. David Packard did. There's a movie where the guy from Dumb and Dumber, Jeff Daniels, he plays David Packard in the movie. So you can actually get to see like the representation. So anyway, they are a globalist, internationalist, New World Order entity, top to bottom. And so they find a guy like Mike Lynch, who's a legit genius and figures out stuff that they can't figure out. And then at some point they're like, we really want to have that stuff as our own. And they cut him a big check, but don't really pay him the big check so easily. And then in the midst of his struggle, he ends up dead in a yachting accident that involves a water spout that nobody saw or has video of, and disappearing weather data, and co-death of defendants in the case, a whole bunch of interesting stuff. So that is a story that is evolving. We still don't have all the details on that, so I'm not going to include more clips this week until we get some more substance out of that situation.
Twice a year, I teach a course called Autonomy. It's a 12-week course. It teaches leadership, entrepreneur skills, executive skills, all these types of things that I saw were taken out of our education system in order to make the schooling or indoctrination system that we've all probably went through. And it has served us well enough to be interchangeable cogs in the machine of the globalists. But if we want a homestead, if we want write our own ticket, work from home job, work from anywhere type of situation, they're not exactly handing those out at the end of college. They give you a piece of paper and they're like, good luck. So reality is dropping us off here, but the demands of reality are up here. So I created Autonomy to help people close that gap for themselves so they can level up their skills to the demands of the situations that life is putting in front of us presently. Life's demands of intellect and understanding precision and complexity are ever increasing. The schooling didn't prepare us for it. The media is not going to do anything but reinforce what schooling prepared us for. And so we're going to have to take a leadership position and take steps off the beaten path to kind of blaze our own trail in life. What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions and we can get into the show and we can share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come on.